There are moments in history that seem like they're read out of fiction. Moments where decisions came down to the last minute or even the last second, forever altering the events afterward. So in this video, we're going to look at two submarine incidents like this at the height of possibly the most tense and consequential moment in global history. One of them just happens to be one of the most brutal and grueling things ever covered on the channel. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In October of 1986, 600 miles off the coast of Bermuda, the Soviet submarine, the K-219, moved through the depths of the Atlantic, armed for the end of the world. Beneath the ocean's surface, the ship carried a terrifying set of weapons. 16 ballistic missiles, each capable of leveling an entire city. And in total, the K-219 carried about 30 nuclear warheads, more than enough to incinerate a continent if the order ever came. On the radar though, the K-219 was just another vessel on routine patrol, but in reality, it was in one of the most sensitive regions of the Cold War, close enough to strike the eastern coast of the United States within minutes, if necessary. At the time, its mission was to conduct internal drills, maintain readiness, and silently remind the Americans that if anything changed, they were equally prepared. At the time as well, the Soviet Union was standing on a razor's edge. Only 6 months earlier, the world watched in horror as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant sent radioactive fire into the sky. The incident embarrassed the Kremlin and enraged its people, and now Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev was preparing for a summit with US President Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik. At the summit, nuclear arms were planned to be discussed and tensions were thin, so it's no exaggeration to say that this was a high-stakes moment in the Cold War. Now, as is sort of a pattern of the sub-stories on the channel, the K-219 was a relic of a rapidly aging fleet. In wartime, the technology just seems to progress so rapidly that by the time something was in operation, it was already out of date. The K-219 was a Project 667A Yankee-class boat which was considered to be a workhorse of the Soviet Navy's ballistic missile division. It had been pushed hard over the years and maintenance had begun to lag. Its crew was also a thrown-together group of young sailors and veterans who barely had time to gel before being sent out on this dangerous mission. Worse still, the sub already bore scars from the past. One of its missile tubes had to be welded shut after a prior chemical incident had nearly gone catastrophically wrong. Still though, the K-219 cruised forward. Inside the control room, Captain 2nd Rank Igor Britanov stood watch. He had been commanding the vessel for 2 years, but even he couldn't have predicted what was coming. Something was brewing deep inside the K-219. On October 3rd, as the sub continued its patrol in the Atlantic, a sudden jolt went through the vessel. The Soviet crew actually first suspected a collision and believed that the Americans were tailing them, specifically a US Navy attack submarine known as the USS Augusta. The Soviets claimed the Augusta had clipped the K-219's hull, possibly damaging its missile tubes. The US Navy, of course, denied everything, and to this day, both sides maintain different truths. But whether it was a bump in the dark or simple bad luck, what happened next was far more catastrophic. At 5:14 a.m. in one of the missile compartments, an officer and an engineer spotted something no one inside a submarine ever wants to see, which was water. Just a few drops at first, seeping from the plug of missile tube number 6 on the port side. Igor was immediately alerted, and at 5:25 a.m. he ordered the sub to ascend to a safer depth around 151 feet or 46 meters. Pumps were then engaged to dry out the missile tube and stop the leak, but it was already too late. The moment seawater met the volatile mix of missile fuel, it triggered a chemical reaction. Brown clouds of nitrogen dioxide and chlorine gas then began hissing out from under the missile plug. The compartment then immediately reeked of burning chemicals and the deadly mist filled the air. Several minutes later at 5:32 a.m., just as an officer called for an accident alert and ordered the compartment sealed, the silo exploded. The force of the blast was enormous, and the missile, which was fully armed, was ejected straight out of the submarine while it was still underwater. Water then flooded the missile compartment instantly, killing 2 sailors on the spot. The shockwave also tore through the hull, and the K-219 began dropping like a stone. From a cruising depth of around 131 feet or 40 meters, the submarine plunged past 985 feet or 300 meters in minutes. Communications were also crippled, the sub's loudspeakers were dead, and compartment after compartment began sealing off in the panic. At one point, up to 25 sailors were trapped in one section, begging for help. It was only after desperate deliberation that Igor gave the order to open the hatch and let them out. Meanwhile, as this was going on, water and corrosive gas continued to spread. Igor then ordered every seawater pump aboard to full capacity, and damage control teams worked by flashlight with gas masks, sealing more compartments to isolate the flooding. Miraculously, somehow the crew managed to stop the descent and bring the sub back to the surface on battery power. It then broke the waves, battered and badly smoking. There was a new and much more serious problem though. In theory, the submarine's 2 nuclear reactors should have automatically shut down the moment the explosion struck. But the blast had damaged key control lines, and down in the belly of the ship, coolant levels were dropping and the reactor temperature was climbing. The automatic systems had failed, so if the crew couldn't do it manually, nothing stood between them and a full nuclear meltdown. Reactor Control Officer Nikolai Belikov and Sergei Preminin then rushed to do what the automatic systems could not, which was to manually insert the control rods to shut down the reactor. This required them to enter the 7th compartment where the reactor was located, which by then had become a hellish environment. The temperature inside is believed to have climbed to as high as 70 to 80 degrees Celsius, and the air was thick with choking acid fumes and near zero visibility. In fact, due to the proximity to the reactor, the fumes are far worse than elsewhere in the sub. Nikolai would then enter first and manage to turn one of the 4 rod assemblies on the first reactor before he would run out of oxygen and die. So with Nikolai dead inside the reactor compartment and the other control rods still unseated, there was no other choice. The 20-year-old Sergei didn't hesitate to step forward and volunteer to finish the job alone. He then opened the compartment hatch and entered what was essentially a nuclear oven. Inside compartment 7, every breath must have tasted like acid. The metal components had begun to warp and swell from the heat, and his uniform was useless against it all. He knew this, but he went anyway. Struggling through the smoke, Sergei reached the 4th control rod and tried to drive it into place, but it wouldn't budge. The rod's casing had deformed under the heat and the guide rail was warped. He wrestled with it, but the resistance was just too much. Then, feeling like he too was about to succumb to the conditions inside the room, he rushed back out for a moment before rushing back inside to try again. On his 2nd attempt, with his muscles straining, his lungs burning, and his vision fading, he forced the rod into position and it clicked. With that, the reactor shut down. There would be no 2nd Chernobyl, nor would there be a radioactive cloud spreading across the Atlantic. The shutdown eliminated the risk of another explosion that could have triggered international panic and possibly war. Sergei had saved not just his crewmates, but possibly millions of lives. With his deadly mission complete, he turned to escape the compartment, and when he reached the hatch, he discovered that it wouldn't open. The gas and heat caused by the near meltdown had warped the pressure between compartments, and the hatch sealed shut like a vacuum lock, sealing him inside. His crewmates tried to force it open from the other side, but the pressure imbalance was too strong. Nothing worked. Sergei was trapped. Crew members called him and pounded on the door, but inside it was growing hotter by the second, and deadly gases were rapidly replacing all the available oxygen. Somewhere in the swirling darkness of compartment 7, Sergei quietly collapsed and died in the chamber. With the reactor finally silenced thanks to Sergei's bravery, the worst-case scenario had been averted, but the K-219 was still bleeding from every physical, chemical, and structural wound it had suffered. Corrosive gas was chewing through the pipes and electrical systems, and the submarine's ventilation system was compromised. Crew members trapped in the bow and stern could no longer coordinate. Radiation levels in the missile compartments were off the charts, and with each passing hour, more gas was spreading through the sub's narrow corridors. The explosion had also robbed the vessel of its propulsion system, leaving it stranded on the surface and running on battery power alone. But over the next few hours, the crew worked to do damage control where they could and move into compartments that were the safest to wait at a rescue. At some point during this, communications were partially restored, and Igor managed to get a signal out to the Soviet fleet. A nearby merchant vessel was then dispatched to assist, and the new plan was to tow the K-219 the 4,300 miles or 7,000 kilometers back to its home port in the Barents Sea. As the merchant ship attached cables and began the slow pull north though, it was immediately clear that it might not make it. Poisonous fumes continued to leak, compartments buckled under pressure, and at one point a fresh rupture in the rear compartment caused toxic gas to surge into the aft sections, contaminating even more of the sub. The crew had to retreat again, packed into the few areas that hadn't been overtaken yet. And incredibly, in the midst of this, Igor was actually ordered to hold position. Command in Moscow wasn't happy. They wanted the sub repaired, the patrol resumed, and the mission salvaged. They even dispatched the K-219's political officer to assume command if necessary and force the crew to remain aboard the crippled vessel. Igor, meanwhile, knew that this was a death sentence. As conditions worsened, he made a decision he wasn't authorized to make. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. The Soviet sailors then climbed aboard the merchant ship, shaken, coughing, and many still wearing gas masks. Igor was the last to leave the sub. He stood alone on its scorched deck until it was clear that nothing else could be done. Moments after he stepped off of the K-219, the tow cable snapped and water surged into the submarine. The K-219 then gave up the fight and slipped beneath the waves for the final time, sinking to the bottom of the Hatteras Abyssal Plain, 18,000 feet or 5,486 meters, and taking with it 2 nuclear reactors and 30 nuclear warheads. Back in Moscow, the sinking was a political nightmare. Soviet President Gorbachev was already walking on a tightrope, as just 6 months earlier his handling of Chernobyl had shaken the Soviet Union's credibility. The global outcry, the internal humiliation, and the environmental devastation was still very raw, and now, in the lead-up to a crucial arms control summit with the US president, another nuclear catastrophe had occurred. Gorbachev's primary concern was the optics of the situation. He didn't want a scandal before the Reykjavik summit, so he did the opposite of what he did in the aftermath of the Chernobyl meltdown. He came clean. Gorbachev then contacted Reagan to inform him of the disaster, and Reagan responded by offering any help the United States could provide. Considering the denials and mishandling of Chernobyl, this did little to repair the relationship between the two countries, but it was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, Gorbachev rushed to place the blame, and it landed mostly on Igor. For all intents and purposes, he was thrown under the bureaucratic bus, charged with negligence, sabotage, and treason. Luckily, though, all charges against him were dropped in 1987. In the aftermath as well, the upper brass scrambled to explain what happened. A recon team that had been sent to inspect the sub while it was still being towed uncovered gas leaks in multiple compartments, corrosion eating through systems, electrical shorts, and reactor cooling issues that could have turned catastrophic. According to the findings, the crew had made a fatal miscalculation by activating the water pump in the leaking missile tube before confirming the electrical status, and this caused a short circuit that likely triggered the explosion. At least, that is what is said to have happened. As with many things from that part of the world, it's not entirely clear if this is actually the case or if this is simply the official story. Whatever the case, since the K-219 sank with its full complement of warheads, there are now plutonium-laced missiles lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. As for Sergei, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Russian Federation in an official capacity. Unofficially, he's known as the hero who prevented a second Chernobyl. Before dawn on October 1st, 1962, 4 Soviet Union submarines slipped out of Seda Bay right along the Kola Peninsula. One by one, at 30-minute intervals, their diesel engines turned on and the ships moved into the black Arctic waters. Among these were a B-36, a B-130, a B-4, and a B-59 sub, and their mission was the furthest thing from a routine patrol. Instead, their departure was part of a Soviet shadow operation codenamed Anadyr, and only a select few on the entire planet knew that what could occur in the next few weeks could potentially bring about the complete end of humankind. Stacked within the bell of each boat were torpedoes, and among them was one tipped with something catastrophic. In the forward compartment of the B-59 was a T-5 nuclear torpedo with a 10-kiloton warhead, roughly the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. The submarines were planned to reach Mariel, Cuba, and establish a Soviet naval presence strong enough to anchor Moscow's rapidly escalating support of Cuban President Fidel Castro. But even most of the Soviet commanders were not aware of the full scope of the mission. True to Soviet doctrine, Operation Anadyr had been cloaked in deception, and even many of the ship captains were told half-truths or nothing at all. The real purpose of the mission was to place the United States within easy striking range of nuclear annihilation, while also prepared to repel any American invasion of Cuba, and the B-59 was the most crucial piece. As the last traces of the Soviet coastline slipped from view and the B-59 disappeared into the ocean, its crew had no idea they were sailing right into the Cold War's most dangerous moment. Above the surface, the war was reaching a boiling point. Just weeks after the B-59 and its sister subs slipped into the Atlantic, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane flew a routine surveillance run over Cuba, and what it captured was jarring to President John F. Kennedy's administration. There were rows of long, unmistakable launch pads under construction, and military analysts quickly confirmed they were Soviet missile installations, less than 100 miles from the Florida coast. Panic then immediately set in behind closed doors in Washington. The Soviets weren't stockpiling defensive weapons in Cuba. These were medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of vaporizing American cities within minutes of launch, and these were being built in secret right under the nose of the world's most powerful military. Kennedy then addressed the nation on October 22nd. He didn't use the word blockade, which might imply an act of war under international law, but he did call his next move a quarantine. American naval ships were then immediately dispatched to encircle the island in order to intercept any Soviet vessel carrying weapons. Kennedy also demanded that the missiles be dismantled and removed, but Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev naturally saw things differently. The Soviet leader denounced the quarantine as piracy and promised that ships would continue their journeys to Cuba. And so began 13 days of an excruciating standoff, two superpowers eyeing each other through crosshairs, fingers twitching above the big red button, daring each other to make the first move. This period would later become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but while American jets flew over the Caribbean and generals mapped out strike plans, below the surface something else was happening. Deep beneath the ocean, the small fleet of Soviet subs that left at the beginning of the month were inching their way toward Cuba and mostly undetected. Their mission had also been carefully timed with missile deliveries. The Americans didn't know yet that the Soviet Union had actually moved 40,000 combat troops into Cuba, or that tactical nuclear weapons were already stationed there under Cuban soil. Operation Anadyr had worked brilliantly and terrifyingly well. Even as American destroyers circled the island, they had no idea how many enemies were hidden just below the surface. Around this same time, in the sea just east of Cuba, the B-59 and its sister submarines arrived with orders to maintain radio silence, but almost immediately everything started going wrong. These Foxtrot-class submarines designed for Arctic waters were unfit for the blistering Caribbean, and mechanical problems began piling up. The B-130's 3 diesel engines would end up giving out completely, forcing the sub to surface in open ocean. This was exactly the kind of spectacle the Soviet Navy had wanted to avoid. And this visual sighting alone kicked the US Navy into high gear. Suddenly, the Americans realized they weren't just dealing with surface ships hauling missiles. American aircraft carriers Essex, Randolph, and Wasp then launched wave after wave of anti-submarine aircraft, and destroyers fanned out across the ocean. More than 200 US combat ships, 4 carrier groups, and nearly 200 aircraft were now committed to the hunt. This was the largest anti-submarine effort the US Navy had ever launched in peacetime. The Soviets, meanwhile, were being systematically cornered. Every submarine in the group was suffering. The B-4's deck hatch had been bent and was leaking, the B-36 had a broken decoy ejector, the B-130 was essentially dead in the water, and the B-59 wasn't immune from trouble either. It was quite literally a hot mess beneath the ocean. The ship's cooling system had been contaminated by salt water, seals were leaking, and its electric air compressors had failed. As a result, inside the ship, it was hellish. A submarine is a tight squeeze under the best conditions. Add in broken ventilation, 9 extra men from a radio intercept unit, and a tropical sea, and you get basically a sweating steel coffin. By October 27th, the B-59 had been submerged for days, hiding from American sonar, starved of oxygen, and low on battery. Radio silence also meant they hadn't received orders or updates from Moscow in more than 72 hours. The only thing they'd managed to pick up before going quiet was President Kennedy's voice over civilian radio stations, and he was warning of the possibility of thermonuclear war. No one aboard knew whether or not the war had actually already begun. In addition, when a US Navy aircraft finally detected the B-59 beneath the surface in the early hours of that Saturday, the Americans didn't hesitate. They started dropping depth charges, not to destroy but to signal the ship to the surface. The problem was, the B-59 didn't know that. The signal wasn't getting through as intended. Instead, to the men aboard, it felt like they were under attack. With temperatures inside the submarine soaring to above 113 degrees Fahrenheit or 45 degrees Celsius, oxygen dwindling, trench foot setting in, and the battery power almost gone, the psychological pressure was crushing. And then came a louder explosion, one that rocked the boat harder than any before, and at that moment, the line between signal to surface and outright aggression shattered. The B-59 captain Valentin Savitsky had had enough. He stood sweat-drenched and furious, and he gave the order to ready the nuclear torpedo. This began what would become known as Black Saturday. On land, the situation was also rapidly spinning toward chaos. US bombers loaded with nuclear payloads were placed on standby, and Strategic Air Command readied thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at Soviet targets. Meanwhile, under the ocean, the B-59 was reaching its own breaking point. Depth charges were still slamming into the water around the sub for hours. From the perspective of the US, this was all by the book. Standard issue, low-charge grenades meant to tell the sub to rise to the surface. Valentin's perspective, though, was much different. There were 14 US warships surrounding the sub, planes flew overhead, blinding lights flashed in the water. The submarine was suffocating with no fresh air, nearly no diesel power left, and barely an hour of battery life remaining. Temperatures inside the engine room reached 149 degrees Fahrenheit or 65 Celsius, and the crewmen were collapsing at their stations. To Valentin, there was only one logical conclusion to make of this chaos: a full-scale nuclear war had already begun. After he gave the order to ready the nuclear torpedo, he assured the crew that they would all die, but they'd take as many Americans with them as they could. There was simply no way he was going to disgrace the Soviet Navy by surrendering. Before he could initiate that, though, there was just one last step. Soviet protocol aboard the B-59 required that 3 men, all senior officers, agree before launching a nuclear weapon. Valentin was more than ready, and so was the political officer Ivan. That left one man, a quiet, serious officer with a haunted look on his face. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. In the sweat-soaked, oxygen-starved command center of the B-59, Vasily stood at a crossroads most people could never comprehend. And strangely, he had been in a somewhat comparable situation just a year earlier when he'd been aboard the K-19. That sub suffered a catastrophic reactor leak, and the incident nearly ended in a nuclear meltdown. Vasily had survived it, but not unscathed. Many of his shipmates died from radiation exposure from that crisis within a month of it occurring, so Vasily was intimately familiar with this kind of pressure. And not only was Vasily a senior officer aboard the B-59, he was also the most senior officer across all 4 submarines in the detachment. This meant that his consent was not optional, it was required. On the 3 other subs, a 2-man approval would have been enough, but on the B-59 at the edge of annihilation, Vasily had the last say. What followed wasn't exactly a calm discussion, it was a raw, heated, and desperate argument. The air stank of diesel and sweat, men were still fainting from heat exhaustion, lights flickered, and amidst it all, Vasily raised his voice not in panic, but in reason. He argued that a war hadn't started. He believed that if the US really meant to destroy them, they already would have. The Americans had numbers, firepower, and air superiority. The relentless depth charging wasn't an attack in his mind, so he proposed something radical: send out a sonar ping, one loud signal to see what came back. Valentin, still fuming but listening to reason, agreed. The ping then ran out throughout the ocean, and the crew braced for retaliation, but nothing came. And suddenly, there were no grenades or blasts, just silence. Sonar swept through the area, and 3 American destroyers, which had been aggressively pursuing the B-59, had come to a full stop. It seemed Vasily's gamble had worked. He turned to Valentin and told him plainly that launching the torpedo would ignite global war, and there would be no coming back from it. Millions, possibly hundreds of millions, would die. In response, slowly and reluctantly, the captain gave the order to stand down. The nuclear torpedo was not launched, and the world, completely oblivious to how close it had come to its end, was spared. Late on the evening of October 27th, after nearly a full day of being hunted, suffocated, and shaken, the men aboard the B-59 finally broke the surface. The ocean around them then erupted into chaos as blinding searchlights from the USS Coney flooded the submarine's conning tower. Helicopters buzzed overhead and American destroyers circled. Aircraft from the Randolph dropped phosphorus markers, igniting midair in bursts of 50 million candle-power light. The Americans, it seemed, were putting on a show, one meant to intimidate, overwhelm, and maybe even humiliate. Valentin then sent a message to the American ships, quote, "This ship belongs to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Halt your provocative actions." There was then a pause, and then remarkably, a response came in the form of an apology from the US. The Americans also didn't board the submarine or force the crew to disarm. They simply monitored the B-59 as it waited in the water when orders finally came in from Moscow for the sub to return home. In response, the crew didn't celebrate, and there was no cheering or relief, just exhaustion. And with that, the B-59 quietly slipped away from the American ships, back into the Atlantic, and turned toward home. Back on land, both superpowers took a long, hard look at what had just happened. Secret negotiations then accelerated, and by the week's end, President Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. Then, quietly in a separate deal, President Kennedy agreed to pull American missiles from Turkey. And so, the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, but no one understood just how close the world had truly come to catastrophe. For decades, the story of the B-59 was kept covered up. The B-59 returned to the Soviet Union under a veil of secrecy, and there were no medals or heroes welcome. In fact, it was quite the opposite. One Soviet admiral, after being briefed on the sub's encounter, reportedly told the crew that it would have been better if they had gone down with their ship. The political elite didn't want to hear about heat stroke or the nuclear torpedo that came within moments of being fired. They wanted clean narratives, and what happened aboard the B-59 didn't fit, so the world remained blissfully unaware of how close it had come to being destroyed. As for Vasily, who returned to duty with no awards or promotions tied to his actions that day, he continued to serve quietly, eventually becoming the head of the Kirov Naval Academy and retiring as vice admiral. The world had no idea that a soft-spoken, unassuming man from a peasant family near Moscow had stood alone in a boiling tin can under the Atlantic and said no to the end of civilization. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the full story began to surface. In 2002, at the 40th anniversary conference of the Cuban Missile Crisis held in Havana, American and Russian officials began comparing notes, and that's when the truth came out. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense during the crisis, was floored. He admitted openly that nuclear war had come far closer than anyone had imagined. The Americans had no idea that the B-59 was carrying a nuclear torpedo. Historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., who had served in the Kennedy administration, called it, quote, "not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history." Meanwhile, the director of the National Security Archive, Thomas Blanton, put it simply, Vasily, quote, "saved the world." In 2017, nearly 2 decades after his death from kidney cancer, likely a consequence of his earlier radiation exposure aboard the doomed K-19, Vasily was finally honored. The Future of Life Institute awarded him the first ever Future of Life Award, given to individuals who often, without recognition or reward, made choices that protected humanity's future. His wife, Olga, accepted the award on his behalf. She had always known the kind of man he was, calm, rational, and humble to a fault. Vasily was the kind of man who carried the weight of history on his shoulders and never once bragged about it. For him, it was never about glory, it was about doing the right thing, and because of that, we're all still here. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.